الله بالخير. قبل 90 سنة أدى التفاوض على اتفاق ترانسفير إلى نقل أكثر من 50,000 ألماني يهودي إلى فلسطين. مستند يكشف تبادلا تجاريا بين الحركة الصهيونية وألمانيا النازية الهتلرية تحت وطأة ضغط مقاطعة المنظمات اليهودية للبضائع الألمانية نتيجة ما يسمونه الإجراءات المعادية للسامية فيها بحسب المؤرخ الفرنسي جون بيير فيليو. فما هي تلك الاعتبارات الصهيونية المخادعة؟ ومن يهيمن اليوم على السردية الفلسطينية؟ 30 عاما على فشل اتفاق أوسلو، هل بات حل الدولة الواحدة قاب قوسين أو أدنى؟ وكيف يؤدي النجاح المتزايد لحركة المقاطعة إلى تجريم إسرائيل وتمزيقها ونبذها؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر من المؤلف علي أبو نعمة، مدير موقع Electronic Intifada في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين، وأنا زينب صفار، خليكم ويانا. علي أبو نيمة، Director of the Electronic Intifada, author of One Country and the Battle for Justice in Palestine. Ali Abu Nima, salam and welcome to Al Mayadeen. This is the proximate aspect. I'm Zainab Al-Safal. Lovely to have you, Ali.
Thank you very much, Zainab. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Always a pleasure, sir. Ali, according to our reference, which discloses that in 1933, Jewish organizations launched an international boycott against German goods to delegitimize the Nazi regime. The Zionist movement, which had become the only authorized Jewish organization in Nazi Germany, finalized a transfer agreement with Hitler's government. Jewish immigrants would recover the value of their assets placed in an escrow account in Germany and exchanged for exported German goods. With Palestine then saturated with German goods in 1935, the Zionist leadership even developed a network to market them in the rest of the Middle East. It was indeed a form of so-called Zionist considerations that prevailed 90 years ago in this transfer agreement. What does that tell us, Ali?
Well, the first important historical context to know is that the vast majority of Jews at the time, and indeed into the 1940s, were anti-Zionist. They opposed Zionism. They opposed what they considered the anti-Semitic idea that they should be removed from their home countries, whether it's Germany or France or Hungary or Poland or wherever it is, and transferred to some other country. What Jews wanted was emancipation and liberation and equality in their countries. This is what the vast majority of Jews supported. The Zionist minority was willing to sell out the vast majority of Jews for its goal of establishing a Jewish settler colony in Palestine. So at the time that you're talking about, there was a global boycott of German goods called for by Jewish organizations to defend Jews in Germany who were under Nazi persecution. When the Zionist organization in Germany made the transfer agreement, or the Ha'avara agreement as it's known in Hebrew, with the Nazi government of Adolf Hitler, this was seen as a betrayal by Jews around the world because it broke the boycott of German goods. And it also reveals the Zionist priority, which was never to rescue Jews from persecution as such, but to send Jews to Palestine to colonize the country. And we saw that this was a consistent policy of Zionist leaders throughout the Nazi period and even into World War II. One of the most notorious, but by no means the only example of that was the Zionist labor leader in Hungary, Resho Kastner, during the Nazi occupation of Hungary, hid from the Jewish community in Hungary the knowledge, which he knew for certain, that Jews were being deported from Hungary by the Nazis and sent to Auschwitz to be murdered. Kastner knew this, but he made a deal with the Nazi occupation authorities in Hungary that he would conceal this reality from the Jews so that the Nazis could send them to their deaths, and in exchange, he and a small hand-picked number of Zionists would be allowed safe passage out of Hungary so they could eventually go to Palestine.
Yes, this is, Ali, the Zionist ideology that was then. This is now. A former top Israeli general said recently, quote, "The Israeli army is becoming a party to war crimes in the West Bank in processes that resemble Nazi Germany. There hasn't been a democracy there in 57 years. There is total appetite," unquote. How do you read this, Ali? How are the Palestinian activists challenging the Israeli appetite in Palestine today?
Well, this is really general. It should be noted. Amiram Levine supports war crimes against Palestinians and has participated in them. He made those comments comparing Israel to Nazi Germany only in the context of opposing the Netanyahu government. And when he talks about there has been no democracy for 57 years, he's talking about since 1967. But as far as Palestinians are concerned, there has never been democracy in Israel.
Exactly. That's very true.
Yeah, since 1948, there has been a racial dictatorship over Palestinians in Palestine. Well, Palestinians, as you know, have tried every kind of method, and they're always advised by liberals in the West that, oh, you should be peaceful and you should use nonviolence and you should go out and do nonviolent things. And they have, of course, done that for years, famously during the Great March of Return in 2018, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, families, men, women, children, the elderly, went in an atmosphere of celebration to protest at the Gaza fence, which separates them from their land and their homes and the rest of Palestine. And Israel's response was to send snipers to murder them. Men, women, children, medics, like the young Palestinian volunteer medic Razan al-Najjar, for example, who many people will remember, were murdered in that context. And so I think the message that Palestinians have understood from Israel is that the only method that Israel respects and will pay attention to is armed resistance. And so we see, of course, Palestinians using armed resistance from Gaza in the West Bank,
exactly,
which is, of course, their right to do. And internationally, of course, yeah.
Yes, Ali, I will come to talk extensively about the armed resistance, but allow me to ask you here, where does the dominant discourse on the Palestine question stand today, and what does it communicate? And are the Palestinians today capable of reclaiming and dominating the Palestinian narrative, and how?
Well, the question or the answer to your question depends on where you're talking about. If you're talking about in the Arab world or in much of the world outside of Europe and North America and the so-called West, the dominant discourse is one of a legitimate anti-colonial liberation struggle. That's how people in the Arab world generally, and in much of what used to be called the Third World, understand the struggle in Palestine. When you go to the West, it's a different picture. And again, of course, it's varied, but you talk about the dominant discourse. They're still in the West, the dominant idea, it's changing now, and that's a good thing. But the dominant idea has been that Israel is a victim, that Israel is the poor, little Jewish state that is being picked on just because Arabs hate Jews and Muslims hate Jews, and that the Palestinians are terrorists. That's the dominant discourse, or it has been the dominant discourse in the West for many decades. So really, the dominant discourse depends on the context of where you are.
Allow me here to ask you, please. By organizing around and promoting the BDS call, are you already changing the narrative? How does the growing success of the BDS, might I say, ostracize and emasculate Israel?
Yes, BDS, which of course stands for Boycott, Divestment
And Sanctions.
And that's a campaign launched by the Palestinians, modeled on the sanctions and boycotts and so on that was imposed on apartheid South Africa during the 1970s and 80s, in solidarity with the liberation struggle in South Africa. And I think it has changed the discourse in the West, which is where the BDS campaigns have been prominent, by returning the issue to the fundamental Palestinian rights. And this is important because the discourse of the so-called peace process, which dominated for many years, reduced the question of Palestine to the so-called two-state solution and ending the occupation at most in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Not even all of the West Bank, because as we know, all of these so-called peace schemes that were promoted by the West wouldn't even return all of the West Bank to the Palestinians. What the BDS movement does is it says, no, the question of Palestine is not just about the West Bank and Gaza. It's not just about establishing a Palestinian statelet in tiny territories of Palestine. It's about the self-determination and liberation of the entire Palestinian people, whether they're refugees, whether they're in the West Bank and Gaza, or whether they are in the 1948 occupied areas in their entirety.
Right. Now, double standards has always been a key term in terms of the Palestinian struggle against the Israeli occupation. For instance, the resistance factions in Gaza went from using missiles that could reach a kilometer or two beyond Gaza's boundaries to one where they can now reach Tel Aviv and even force a shutdown of Israel's main airport. After each Israeli attack, Ali, we witness the regular choir of international condemnation, as you said, that Palestinian rocket fire in response to Israeli attacks is illegal and even a war crime. Is Palestinian rocket fire illegal? According to the international law, are there limitations to the exercise of the right of resistance? Briefly, if I may.
The right of resistance is recognized and protected in international law. What some human rights organizations, Western human rights organizations, have claimed is that the rocket fire from Gaza is a war crime because the rockets are unguided and therefore inherently indiscriminate. Now, of course, any kind of struggle has to have some kind of rules and some kind of ethics, but it seems absurd to me to say that Israel is entitled, as Western governments do say, is entitled to use precision weapons to attack civilian infrastructure, not just in Gaza and Palestine, but of course, as we know, in Lebanon. The so-called Dahya doctrine, which Israel uses in Gaza, is named after the Dahya of southern Beirut, where the Israelis said, okay, we are unable to defeat the Lebanese resistance on the battlefield, soldier to soldier, so we'll attack apartment buildings, electricity, roads, bridges, using precision weapons against civilians. In Gaza, we see that the resistance uses unguided rockets because they don't have precision guided systems.
Yes.
But they still try to aim them as best as they can in many cases.
Yes, since you mentioned the Dahiya doctrine, this year we celebrate 17 years to the resistance victory and the Israeli humiliating defeat in its July 2006 aggression against Lebanon, all Lebanon. A, why it matters. B, Israel lobbyists and Washington planners tried to spin the confrontation not as one between a US-backed settler colonial aggressor and legitimate indigenous armed resistance, but in sectarian confessional terms. Did this sectarian politics and rhetoric, mobilized and still is by the US, underpin the logic of normalization deals between Israel and various Arab regimes?
Yes.
And the victory, why it matters?
Yes. I remember I actually visited southern Lebanon, liberated southern Lebanon in July of 2000. So really less than 2 months after the liberation. And it was one of the most inspiring experiences I ever had in my life to see people returning to their homes, to see their pride in the resistance. I visited Khiam detention, the Khiam prison in southern Lebanon. And we were given a tour at that time by former prisoners who showed us how they were tortured by the Israelis and their collaborators in Lebanon. So this was an historic victory. It was an incredible testament to the resistance and the struggle of the people in Lebanon. And it deserves to be celebrated and known. But it was also historic because it showed that, contrary to the image which had been promoted for many years, the Israeli army is not invincible. It could be defeated, and it left in humiliation in 2000. They never recovered from that humiliation. And so I think part of the motivation in 2006 for the Israeli aggression in Lebanon was to try to restore their image. And they failed even more badly because the defeat in 2006 was not just a defeat for Israel, it was a defeat for the United States and its designs in the region. Because remember what Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State of the United States, was saying at the time. She said, these are the birth pangs of a new Middle East.
True.
And we had Seymour Hersh, the great American investigative journalist, who revealed that the American intention for the Israeli attack on Lebanon in 2006 is this would be a trial run for an American, or perhaps even a joint American-Israeli attack on Iran. So this was supposed to be a test of their methods, of their bombs, of I don't know what, of their strategies.
Right.
So the defeat in Lebanon protected not just Lebanon, but protected the region. Now, as far as the sectarian discourse is concerned, it escalated in particular after 2006. Of course, it wasn't new, but I remember, as you will, that after 2006, Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance were seen as heroes across the region. They were seen as an Arab nationalist resistance to Israel. So after 2006, there was an effort to paint them as not Arab, not nationalist, not a legitimate resistance, but to paint them as Shia proxies of non-Arab Iran. And this sectarian discourse was very powerful, and it was mobilized particularly in the war against Syria. The American led and Israeli-supported regime change war in Syria used the same sectarian logic. But I think with the failure of this sectarian logic, we're starting to see it recede a little bit, like when the sea recedes, when the tide recedes from the beach. I think the that this sectarian logic and this sectarian discourse is receding as people see more clearly who the true wreckers and destroyers in the region have been for so long. And it's not any of the people of the region. It is the United States and its proxies, of course, particularly Israel.
Right. The two-state solution is dead with 1,000 cuts. Why do you believe, Ali, that the one-state solution is the only solution for Palestine?
Palestine is already one state, but it is a Zionist apartheid settler colony. The division of Palestine was always artificial. It was always designed to try to save Israel, to save a so-called Jewish state within smaller borders where the Jews would be a majority. But Israel never wanted that. Israel is the one who rejected the two-state solution, which the Palestinians and even the whole Arab world had accepted at one point. But Israel said, no, we have to have everything. We have to have 100% of the land. And to hell with the Palestinians. We don't care what happens to them. They can leave, or we can expel them, or they can live under our boots. And if they don't like it, we'll kill them. This isn't a proposition the Palestinians can accept. So what we see now is that things are returning in a way to the right path of history. Palestine, I believe, will be a unified country. Those people of any background, whether they're Jewish, whether Muslim, whether Palestinian, whether
Christians, true.
Whether they want to stay and live in peace as equal citizens, as happened in South Africa, will be welcome. But if they want to live as colonizers, as rulers, to impose their way on the indigenous Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian people of the country, they won't be able to do that. Look at South Africa today. It's not a utopia. It's not a perfect country. No country is perfect, but you have people living under a constitution which provides equality for everyone. Of course, there needs to be more economic equality. That's true in our region as well. But I think that will be a much better future for our region than the reality we have now, or partition along racial, sectarian, and ethnic lines, as proposed in the so-called, and as you pointed out, very dead two-state solution.
Right. Why is Palestine fundamental and central to the anti-imperialist resistance, Ali?
It is central, and it's central because in a way it's the last major decolonization struggle of the 20th century. It's the unfinished business of decolonization. And even we see now today across Africa, yes, there was formal decolonization in the 1960s and 70s, where many countries gained nominal independence, but they didn't gain true independence because they remained under French or British or American neocolonialism. Now we see, in a sense, the second wave of decolonization, with France being kicked out of Africa, country after country, and the United States slowly being kicked out of the Middle East, where it has no business whatsoever. And Palestine really is the linchpin, because Israel's power cannot exist without U.S. imperialism in the region. And at the same time, U.S. imperialism has depended on Israeli power. So Israel and the United States depend on each other. As U.S. power in the region wanes, Israel's power will wane too. Right. And I think the liberation of Palestine will be an inspiration to people all over the world for their liberation as well.
True. Ali, we can listen to you all day long, but unfortunately time has run short. Ali Abu Nima, Director of the Electronic Intifada, thank you very much, sir. Huge pleasure to have you always, Ali.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
حكومات الاحتلال السابقة بذلت جهودا بائسة للحفاظ على الانطباع الخاطئ عن أن الكيان الإسرائيلي منفصل إلى حد ما عن المشروع الاستيطاني في الأراضي الفلسطينية والسورية المحتلة، بينما في الواقع فإن كل جانب من جوانب هذا الكيان بما في ذلك ما يسمى القضاء المحاصرة حاليا متورط حتى النخاع في المشروع الاستيطاني المقيت. المستوطنون والكيان واحد، يعملان يدا بيد لاحتلال الأرض الفلسطينية واغتصابها. التهجير القسري تحت وطأة الإرهاب والعنف والتنكيل يحدث الآن في الضفة الغربية المحتلة. إسرائيل تستخدم عنف المستوطنين في طرد المزيد والمزيد من الفلسطينيين من منازلهم. في الأشهر الستة الأولى من عام 2023 تقدمت إسرائيل بالموافقة على بناء نحو 13,000 وحدة استيطانية في الضفة الغربية، وهو الأعلى على الإطلاق، والعالم يتفرج. ولكن هذه الاعتبارات الصهيونية الخداعة والواهية، وعلى الرغم من الجهود الحثيثة للتطبيع مع هذا الكيان الواهن والمتوحش، لا تؤثر في المقاومة بكل ساحاتها، والتي ما زالت قدراتها المتصاعدة وقوتها المتنامية تسددان ضربات قاسمة. من كل الميادين سلاما وتحية، في مال.